Do streamers have an indirect units on the balance of some champs? They can. A lot of league power is trickle down, meaning that a lot of what players in low MMRs do is learned from high MMR players, especially like very, very prevalent streamers. So a very easy example of this is TheBAUSFFS playing Scion. BAUSFFS played Inting Scion, and then a lot of other people started playing Inting Scion, and Inting Scion became like kind of a problem, right? And like we eventually had to nerf it, and like that probably wouldn't have happened without the BAUSFFS. Another great example of this is KESHA. KESHA is an incredibly talented and unhinged Nunu player who popularized AP Nunu. And he plays AP Nunu in Challenger, and he has a massive following, and AP Nunu is not good compared to tank Nunu, at least historically. It's hard to tell now because so few people play tank Nunu, like pure tank Nunu anymore. And so I can't really show you the data because it's just not as much of a thing anymore, but actually I'll show you this. Like this is from 14.8. This is from a while ago. You'll notice that if you look here, Nunu's tankier builds, like these two, tend to win more than his more AP builds. And this historically has been the thing for Nunu, is Nunu tends to be actually a lot stronger historically if you built him tank. That's less true nowadays because we've buffed his AP ratios since then, but the reason Nunu became more AP is because of KESHA. And so we'd actually have patches where we'd go look at Nunu's win rate, and it would be like 47, and we'd be like, yo, we should buff this character. This character sucks. And then we'd look at his item pick rates and be like, oh, everybody's just doing the KESHA build. And if they just built tank, they'd win all their games. And so that's an example of a character, a streamer who mind controlled all of the Nunu players in the game into inting, which is, you know, fun to think about. And it's not just him. Like there's, you know, AP Nunu players in other regions that also like, you know, stream and like, you know, people moving towards. But yeah, like big streamers can have an influence on balance indirectly in the sense that if people pick up their builds, and that tends to happen, especially if they're really good at the game, those builds can be dispersed throughout the entire game, and then we're going to ask the question at Riot of whether or not we should like be looking at whatever those characters are doing. And so, yeah. KALISTA's weak, but she has presence in Pro. Can you show me what you were looking at? Yeah, so if you go to the site Games of Legends, you can kind of see what pros are playing. I would sort by top leagues. We balance at Riot around top leagues. We don't balance around like the other leagues. And then you can sort by like patch. I'm assuming 14.16, yeah. 14.16 doesn't really have much data right now, so you can't really look at it. But if you look at, if you sort by patch and you go to bot lane and you look at 14.15, and you look at presence, you'll notice that KALISTA has a 45% presence, and she has a lot of bans. And so this is a character that would probably be a big mistake for us to buff. Because KALISTA at 45% win rate, especially since she is so banned, probably goes to the moon if we buff her too much. Now, this sucks if you're a solo queue player, because the character is probably legitimately weak in solo queue, but that is the tragedy of KALISTA. She's a character like Azir, who is basically going to eternally, forever be balanced around pro play. And so we can never really buff her unless this disappears. If KALISTA's presence in pro ever started cratering, it would be a very good reason to buff her. So as an example right now, I would consider buffing APHELIOS, because you'll notice he is not present in pro really at all right now, which is pretty off given that's a character that you would expect to see in pro. So APHELIOS is a character where if he's not in pro at all, it probably means we should buff him. It probably needs, he could use a little buffy buff. But KALISTA in this case is already fairly present, and because of that, we probably shouldn't buff her, because she it's highly likely she could take over pro play if we did. So yeah, that's the hard part about KALISTA. Characters like KALISTA, APHELIOS, Azir, they're going to be eternally balanced around pro play just because of what their kits are like, but it does mean that you can find out if they need to be buffed by looking at their presence. And if their presence in pro is very, very low, it probably means we should buff them. So that's kind of the thing there. I want to buff BRIAR, but she's really good. I cannot justify buffing BRIAR when she has this win rate. This is a strong character. But dang it, she's so hard to win with in Diamond, man! Ah! Honestly, I wish I could just make her ultimate a bit more reliable. That spell is so hard to hit. Oh well. Oh well. She's good. She's a strong character. Blade of the Ruined King makes a lot of sense on her. I'm glad this item is finally good on BRIAR, because I designed her for this item. If you notice, I've designed a lot of characters for this item. I designed her to make use of Blade because, of course, she has the healing amp, and so it makes a lot of sense to me that she'd be good with Blade of the Ruined King. So I'm happy to see that that she's finally picking it up. And I think it fits a lot with her fantasy. I think that's one thing that you have to think about with character design, is basically designing a character to build the items that would be fun on them is kind of the abstract of it. Designing a character to be good with the items that would be fun on them in the abstract is, I think, really important. Because there's lots of characters where, like, they can be viable with certain items, but that doesn't necessarily mean those items make them enjoyable to play, even if they're viable. And so BRIAR, if she's, like, rushing tank every game, is probably not nearly as fun as if she's rushing Blade of the Ruined King. Even if, imagine both of those were equally powerful, right? So I'm glad to see that BRIAR is building Blade of the Ruined King right now, and it's viable on her because I genuinely think that's an item that makes her more fun to play. As someone that's been part of the KATARINA New Years, the problem is that she's not weak, but very unfun to play because of how much weaker she is in lane since the durability patch. I agree that characters are weaker in lane of the durability patch. Assassins like Cat definitely have suffered a bit. That said, if you're complaining about the Q, you do need to understand that the Q makes you stronger in lane, right? Like the Q change is a meaningful laning buff. And so if one of your issues with Cat is that she's good in lane, I don't think you should then like turn around and say the Q changes are bad, because the Q changes straight up make her a more functional, more versatile laner, because you can use it to last hit, you can use it to get minions, and you can use it to throw it at the champion and get them in kill range in a way that like is harder to do without all-inning, like would normally be harder to do without all-inning. And so the goal of those Q changes was to help out her laning phase, and if that's something you think is important to Katarina, I would argue that those Q changes are pretty good. Do they get her all the way? Possibly not, right? Like, the character might need a lot more, but Q being a good spell, I would argue, is a very important part of making Katarina an enjoyable, playable laner. Now, the other part of that is she needs to be able to kill you at times, right? Like, it would be lame if all you could do is throw Qs and you could never kill your opponent. So I'm not saying she's in a perfect spot, and I'm not saying she shouldn't be able to kill you, but I am saying that like an important part of the assassin formula in mid lane, especially in a world where we won't just let them kill you from full, is the ability to have a bit more versatility in how you interact with your lane and your opponent, which is Katarina's Q allows her to do.